Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event. My name is Josie, and I am the Events and Social Media Coordinator for Madison Street Books. We are a new-ish indie bookstore in Chicago's West Loop. We opened in March of 2020, and we are so excited to be partnering with New American Economy for tonight's event. Just a little housekeeping before I introduce our guests. This is Crowdcast. Please feel free to continue talking in the chat. I love when everyone introduces themselves. We can see where everyone's from. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little Ask a Question button. If at any time during the event you have a question for any of our speakers, you can drop it there, and we will have a little Q&A session at the end. And so let me start introducing. I'll go alphabetically here. Nawaaz Ahmed was born in Tamil Nadu, India. Before turning to writing, he was a computer scientist researching search algorithms for Yahoo. He holds an MFA from University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and is the recipient of residencies at McDowell, Yaddo, DeGrassi, and VCCA. He's also a Kundiman and Lambda Literary Fellow. His debut novel, Radiant Fugitives, this year was longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, and he currently lives in Brooklyn. Jai Chakrabarti's short fiction has appeared in numerous journals and has been anthologized in the O. Henry Prize Stories, the Best American Short Stories, and awarded a Pushcart Prize. Chakrabarti was an emerging writer fellow with A Public Space and received his MFA from Brooklyn College. He was born in Kolkata, India, and now splits his time between Brooklyn, New York, and the Hudson Valley. A Play for the End of the World is his first novel. And Andrew Lim, our moderator for the evening, is the Director of Research at the Partnership for a New American Economy, NAE, a bipartisan coalition of business and political leaders working to create smart, sensible immigration policies in cities, states, and nationally. He has more than a decade of research experience in international migration, integration, and public policy through his work with NAE, the NYC Mayor's Office of Policy and Strategic Planning, and the Council on Foreign Relations. Andrew holds master's degrees in urban policy and regional and urban planning, and he also received his MBA from Boston College in international relations and French. Without further ado, I will turn it over to our speakers.
Great, thanks so much, Josie. Really excited to be part of this conversation. As just mentioned, I'm Andrew Lim. I'm the Director of Research at NAE, and what that blurb didn't really talk about was how the arts and culture sort of wing of NAE is trying to not only work in tandem with our research work, which tries to inform the debate about immigration in the United States, but also to uplift and showcase stories about immigration and about immigrants and their experiences here in the United States. And so that's where this conversation plays that role. So just to give, I'm sort of really just here to provide a little bit of context for the rest of this conversation about these two great books. They both are focused and centered around the immigrant story in the United States, and wanted to just talk a little bit about that and how you can kind of contextualize what we're about to talk about. And so in the from the first author that we heard from Jai, his book features a refugee from Poland, a Jewish refugee. And really this has its roots in terms of immigration policy, really in the aftermath of World War II, obviously. And the modern day refugee resettlement program that we have today is really based on all the things that Congress did to authorize the welcoming of refugees fleeing from, obviously, the after effects of World War II, but during the Cold War, people fleeing communist regimes. And so this starts with the Refugee Relief Act in 1953 that created these non-quota immigrant visas for refugees from communist countries, followed shortly thereafter by the 1956 Hungarian escapee program, sort of following the Hungarian Revolution, which was crushed by the Soviets, and welcoming people escaping that. And so you see throughout the 50s and 60s and early 70s, Congress doing things to pass one-off acts to respond to these kinds of waves of refugees, especially those fleeing from communist countries. So more well known, obviously, Cuba, which the policy still exists today, people who were fleeing communist China into Hong Kong, and then obviously well known the influx of people fleeing after the Vietnam War. And it's really not until the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965 that there are a set number of annual visas put aside specifically for refugees to come. And then following that in 1967, the United Nations established its protocols for refugees. But it's really not until 1980 that we start to see, or really the creation of the modern day refugee resettlement program that we have today, which works in tandem with the United Nations to identify refugees, to vet them, to make sure they go through all of these processes to ensure basically that they are the most documented people in the world. And so since then, the United States has welcomed more than 3.5 million refugees from around the world. And until recently, it was really considered the leading country in terms of refugee resettlement. But really going back to that 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, it has actually been getting a lot of press because of the 2020 census showing that the United States was more diverse than ever before. And a lot of this has to do with this one act in 1965 that radically changed the immigration system in the United States. And so prior to 1965, what we had in the United States was something called the National Origins Formula, which was created in 1921, but that act basically eliminated or barred any immigration from Asia. What it said was, rather the formula was that the quota from each country would be set at 3% of the immigrant population of that nationality that was in the United States in 1910. So as you can imagine, the Indian, the Chinese, the Japanese population in the United States in 1910, very, very small. And so that was their way of essentially barring Asian immigration. They also followed that up in 1924 with the Asian Exclusion Act, which limited immigration or permanent residency in the United States to people who would be eligible for naturalization. And so as a result, East Asians and South Asians were effectively banned from immigrating because under the law at that time, they were not able to become US citizens. So the 1965 Immigration Act, or the Hart-Celler Act, was really transformative when it comes to immigration, but also how the US looks today. And so Nawaaz's work looks at immigrants from South Asia and how they've come here. And so you see from 1965, when you had basically 97% of immigration coming from Europe, to today, where immigrants from Asia make up the largest group of immigrants coming to the United States. And actually that has been the case since 2009. So since 2009, there have been more new arrivals from Asia than there have been from Latin America. And so that's the first time in US history that has been the case. And if you look at the most recent data, obviously 2020 aside, annually around 1 million immigrants come to the United States each year. And the top countries of origin for those new immigrants are China, closely followed by India, and then Mexico, and then the Philippines. So you have a great representation from Asia that would not be possible without the 1965 Act. But given the legal pathways that were afforded Asian immigrants into the United States from the 1965 Act, these are not only family reunification, but most notably employment-based visas and visas that were meant to basically capture high-skilled workers and highly educated workers. You have a skewing of these immigrant populations here in the United States, especially of those from Asia, who tend to skew very highly educated and very highly or disproportionately in white-collar professions. And so that has other ramifications as well. We've heard a lot this year in terms of breaking down that model minority stereotype, but that has, these have grounds in just the way and the history of immigration in the United States. So I just want to stop there, not to throw too much information and data at you first, but really to let us to dive into the actual books and the meat of the matter. So I'll pass it on to Jai.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was so informative, and I feel like I was taking lots of great notes for things that I didn't know about until this moment. And thank you, Nawaz, for joining me this evening. I so love Nawaz's book, Radiant Fugitives, and can't wait to hear him read from it later. So I was thinking about what to share with you all this evening, and I was thinking about this context of stories that refugees carry from one country to another. And there's some stories that we share easily, and other stories that we keep closely to ourselves. And so I'm going to read a short section from my novel where the main character Misha and main characters Misha and Yarek are meeting each other in a displaced persons camp in Germany. This is after World War II, and it's shortly before they immigrate to the United States. And Yarek, the main character, shares the story of how he survived after the war, and it's a story that he doesn't tell anyone else. So this is really a story that he shares with the readers. Here we go. Up until the last days of September 1942, it had been possible to live by Misha's training. Where Yarek had escaped from the train was a long stretch of forest, and he found himself tracking the sunlight to sources of water and discovering, as Misha had taught him those weeks of summer camp, which fruits to eat and how to make a shelter. Nearby, there was a farm, and at night he would steal into the chicken coop and leave with a handful of eggs. Then it began to get cold. The first time he awoke with frost over his fingernails, it was a Sunday. He knew this because the farmer's family was wearing their church-going clothes, and it meant he might be able to sneak into their house for a bowl of hot soup, the kind with beets, and thick strips of meat, or perhaps even some baked bread. He could barely wait until they were gone. They had a son a little older than him, and perhaps he would borrow the boy's coat. His arms were freezing fast. He counted the screws that jutted from the wall of the barn door where he hid until the family settled into their donkey carriage. When the carriage left, he crept into the house through an open window, but he found that the grandmother had been left behind. She was sitting in a high-backed chair by the fireplace that took up half the room, and when he landed on the floor and locked eyes with her, it seemed that she had been waiting for him. She didn't say a word, but it was as if she knew exactly how many eggs he'd taken, as if she were counting in her head the price of his thievery. She rose from her chair and produced a switch from the folds of her skirt. He tried to escape, but she was quicker than she'd first appeared. She held him by the ear. She beat him so fiercely on his bottom that he forgot to weep. But the next week, the cold only crept deeper into the earth, and the shelter he had made from leaves and branches wasn't enough. It was the first time he awoke in the middle of the night wishing to be dead. He had known hunger on Clodna Street and Siena Street, but this was a different kind of pain. Now he was hungry, but also alone, and loneliness sharpened hunger's bite. That week, he raked his nails against the maple trees to see if he could release their sap. His fingers came away bloodied, and he blamed Pandoktor for giving them hope when none was to be had. Next Sunday, he returned again to the house, wishing for the same, a coat and a portion of soup. The grandmother was sitting exactly where she'd been the week before. This time she looked at him like she was disappointed. She watched him for a while, and as he stood there, he took note of the singular silver braid that curled down her neck, the heavy gullet that swayed as she rocked in her chair, and those eyes as blue as the sky above the river Vistula. When he made for the vat of soup, she grabbed him and brought him back to the rocking chair. She pulled his trousers down and beat him 13 times with the warm end of the rod she'd used to stir the fire. This time, he wept with shame. He wept for his own fate, for the fate of his community, for the fate of everyone who would soon be born into this wretched world. As the blows landed on his bottom, he felt a little grateful for the warmth of the fire, and his cheeks burned with the weight of such miserable gratitude. The fourth Sunday he saw her. He could barely walk, so great was his hunger. It had been 8 weeks since he'd talked with anyone, and his voice was parched, but he cleared his throat and spoke. "Your soup," he said, pointing at the simmering pot from which he could smell the meat and vegetables. "Smells so good." When she stood up to her full height, he didn't take a step back. He only wanted a taste. Then he would leave. He wouldn't bother them again. He wouldn't even bother to make his shelter of leaves. Instead, after a taste of her soup, he would allow his body to float in the stream, where tiny sheets of ice had begun to decorate the surface with crystal rainbows. She grabbed him by the ear. There was no hint of mercy on her face, but this time she did not beat him. Instead, she dragged him to the yard, all the while yanking on his ear, as if her purpose was to separate it from his head, dragged him to the barn, unlocked the padlock, and threw him in with the goats. A minute later, she came by with a cup of soup, grunting as he watched her for signs of his turning fortune. He didn't wonder if she could speak. He didn't wonder why the rest of the family didn't take her to church. Instead, he drank the broth with his remaining strength, coughing as a strip of meat became lodged in his throat. She hit him hard between his shoulder blades, and he fell forward and kissed her feet. This was how he lived the 12th year of his life. And with the spring and the thawing of the road, he saw a line of men and women. It was the longest line he had ever seen. For a while, he simply counted the arms and legs. Thousands of the bedraggled passed the farm, smelling of rot and dirt. No one bothered to stop. But when he had counted as high as he could, he kissed the goats and ran to join that great zigzag. What finally pushed him, 2032, he still remembered counting, a slow welling of terror, some old spirit who rose up as hunger, who rose up as fierce as hunger, commanded him, "Go." And I'll pause there, and that's the moment when he is joining the other refugees who are escaping from the camps of World War II, and ultimately he'll head to the displaced persons camp in Germany, after which he'll go to America, as so many did in that time. And Nawaaz, I want to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jay. I mean, that is an absolutely stunning piece of scene. I remember reading that just a few weeks ago, and hearing you read it now just brings it back so vividly, and it's very painful but profoundly moving piece. Thank you for reading that, and thank you for inviting me to be here as part of this. And also thank you, Andrew, for that introduction, and also for the work New American Economy does for the kind of bridges that it builds in the immigration debate. Is the kind of work that we need in this country. And so thank you for that. My novel, Radiant Fugitives, follows two Muslim sisters, immigrants from India, one a lesbian activist in San Francisco, the other a devoutly religious gynecologist living in Texas with her family. During the week the two sisters spend together, they have to grapple with not only their frayed relationship, but with the divisions within the country as well. I'm going to be reading from some sections that follow the religious sister Tahara's family in Texas. Her husband Ismail is involved in fundraising for the expansion of their mosque to build it into a community center with playgrounds and a gym. It's 2010. Obama was elected president 2 years earlier. He had given a speech in Cairo to the Islamic world. I am firm in my belief that the interests we share as human beings, justice and progress, tolerance and the dignity of all human beings, are far more powerful than the forces that drive us apart. But the congressional elections are looming, and Islamophobia has been on the rise again in the country. So these two sections kind of speak to that. I wanted to start with this small excerpt about the fundraiser itself, and then follow it up later with the aftermath of the fundraiser. At the fundraiser that evening, Arshad is a super kid in his royal blue kurta pajama and his crocheted white prayer cap. He's miraculously at hand whenever someone is needed, to carry messages between organizers, to track down particular members of the community, to guard the video camera during the videographer's breaks. Now he directs attendees to the spaces for various events. Now he hands out pens and ink and paper for the calligraphy competition. Now he works the slides on the laptop during Imam Zia's speech about the future of the center. He's a whirlwind in blue, streaking through the swelling throng, the men in suits and salwars and jeans and kaftans, the women churidar and jilbabed and abayad and hijabbed, the young boys and girls dressed to their parents' tastes in bright and shiny traditional outfits of every gaudy hue. After the Isha Namaz, there's only one event left, the Quran Jeopardy. Originally, his father was supposed to conduct it. Arshad had helped him put the quiz together and he's excited. But Ismail has since assumed post outside to supervise the activities in the lot, and the role of quizmaster has fallen to Imam Zia. Imam Zia, elegant in his navy blue robe, begins with a disclaimer in his rueful British accent. Pardon me if I botched this. I'm not too familiar with this American format of answering with a question. And as I didn't prepare this quiz, I may not even know all the answers myself. But brother Arshad over here definitely does. A round of applause for him, please. He helped create the quiz. The audience claps, turning to look at him, and he's thrilled at being singled out for his praise and for being addressed as brother. And what could be more fun than the contest that unfolds? His father could never have been as entertaining as Imam Zia, who's funny and can quote from the Quran and narrate incidents from the Hadith to support the answers. He teases the participants good-naturedly when they get an easy question wrong. Once, Imam Zia tisk-tisks when nobody gets the question right, and he points to Arshad and says, "Why, even a 12-year-old knows this." Arshad is called to shout out the answer. "What is Ikhra?" He adds, "And I'm 11. Yes, Ikhra, to read, to recite, the very first word of the glorious Quran as revealed to the Prophet, peace be upon him, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's messenger, the angel Jibreel. That is the first command that Allah bade the Prophet and all Muslims, but more than just to read, to understand the Quran, to follow the Quran. Every time after that, when the contestants are stumped, Imam Zia eggs the audience to chant, even an 11-year-old knows this, and Arshad gets to call out the answer." I'm going to follow that with the section of the aftermath of the fundraiser. The fundraiser goes well and everybody's happy. And so this is on the next morning. Sunday morning, Irvine. Ismail wakes up for Fajr to the shrill cry of the alarm clock. He lies in bed basking in the memory of the fundraiser. Masha Allah, they had raised more money than they thought they would. A bleary-eyed Arshad joins him in the living room and they pray Fajr together. After the namaz, Ismail is too energized to go back to bed, and he busies himself with the spreadsheets on his computer, tabulating donations and expenses, starting the report he'll share with the committee. It's not even 7 when he receives a call from Imam Zia. He answers eagerly. "I'm sorry to bother you so early, brother Ismail," Imam Zia interrupts, "especially after all your great work. But can you come over? There's some trouble at the mosque." "What trouble?" Ismail asks. "Some stuff on the walls. Not very nice. We should do something about it." At that moment, Ismail is still floating high, and despite knowing Imam Zia's tendency towards understatement, he assumes the matter is trivial, perhaps some child who had splattered paint on the walls during the calligraphy competition. "Sure, I'll be there as soon as I can." He gives the children another half hour of their Sunday sleep, then wakes them and tells them to get ready. The mosque is aglow in the golden morning light, the blazing green of the dome, the shimmering ivory of the stucco walls. A group of men stands on the steps of the main entrance, silhouetted against the lit walls. Imam Zia recognizable by his taller figure and turban. Ismail parks and encourages the children to run toward the mosque. Striding toward the men, he feels elated and raises his hand in greeting. The sun is behind him, his long shadow ahead, waving in its turn, but the men don't seem to notice him. He's still some distance away when Arshad shouts, "Abba, look!" Arshad is pointing towards Imam Zia, who's rubbing at the wall of the mosque with the edge of his robe, and only as Ismail draws nearer does he notice the virulent red scrawl. From that detail, his eyes pan to take in the entire red-stroked front wall of the mosque, which had until then been hidden by the canvas sides of the shamiana set up the previous day. It takes him many more seconds before he's able to put the strokes together to form letters, then words. "Arshad, Amina, come back," he yells, breaking into a run toward them, not knowing why he's running, only that he must stop them before they get closer to the walls. Does he imagine the paint is blood? He recalls reading about the blood of pigs used on mosques, recalls images of blood streaming down victims of bomb blasts. He pounds the gravel of the parking lot as if he were trying to crush the pebbles into the ground. Amina freezes where she is, and he picks her up, then increases his stride until he catches up with Arshad and yanks him around. "Abba!" Arshad whimpers, and Ismail is not sure whether it's in reaction to the desecration of the mosque or if he's hurting his son's arm. I'll stop there.
What a powerful reading. Thank you so much, Nawaaz, and thank you, Andrew. So now we're going to get into more of the open discussion and conversation. And for anyone who is in the audience, feel free to join in and post a question or share your thoughts in the chat. So I'm going to kick off with a question for you, Andrew, and it's this idea of how narratives have shifted, and you've been at NAE now for 10 years. And the stories around immigration, it seems to me, have undergone various transformations over the years. So I'm curious if you could walk us through how the story of immigration has changed during your time with the NAE.
Sure. Wow, that's a great question. It's a interesting transformation. I think I started at NAE in the second Obama administration, and there was really, I think, at least it felt like at the time, like there was progress to be made. So leading up to 2013, there was a lot of momentum around being able to reform the immigration system in the United States. You obviously had the bills in the House and then ultimately the Senate where it failed. But that bill was really, a lot of hopes were pinned to it, and especially for undocumented immigrants and for dreamers, and for people who are caught up in, all the different backlogs and waiting lists and all those kinds of things, whether it's to be reunited with their family, to have a green card or citizenship. And so since then, it's been a difficult time. Obviously, the country has become more polarized. When you would poll people in the United States about immigration, generally there is the sentiment, or there was, that immigrants were good for the United States, and it's a bit of a nebulous phrasing, and I think that's why it was a generally positive sentiment. And then, so when you get into the more specifics of it, that's when you start to see the nuances in terms of people's political persuasions. And so I would say the best example of this is refugees, right? Refugee resettlement has never really been controversial except for the past, say, 5 years, we'll say. It really was not part of our work. We didn't think it was a group of immigrants that needed our particular way of reframing the immigration debate. We were founded as a way for people on the right who generally talk about immigration in terms of law and order, amnesty, illegal, things like that. And on the left, where people are much more focused around human rights, about the moral arguments in favor of immigration, things like that. But what we wanted to do is to create a middle ground where people could talk about common prosperity and how immigration plays into that. And so because of that, refugees didn't, in our mind, need that. They were here because there was a humanitarian concern that had primacy. You didn't question that these people who were fleeing war, who were fleeing conflict, needed a reason more than their lives to be allowed into the United States. But really what happened after 2016 was that we were basically approached by refugee resettlement agencies themselves, who were saying our traditional ways of talking about refugees, this very vulnerable group, is no longer resonating in the way that it has for the past 30 years. And would you be able to do research in a similar vein to what you do for immigrants writ large for refugees? And so that really sort of opened our eyes to this phenomenon of previously, I would say, sympathetic groups of immigrants becoming less and less supported by the U.S. Population in general. Similarly, you see an erosion of support for Dreamers. When DACA was first introduced, there was widespread support on both sides of the aisle for allowing children who were brought here to this country, documented by their parents, and have spent their entire, conscious lives in the United States to stay. The support for that actually has been decreasing, which is a worrying trend as well. And so I think, unfortunately, what we're seeing is that attitudes towards immigration are becoming hardened in a way that is worrying, because it removes, the middle ground gets smaller and smaller.
Thank you for bringing that perspective of the refugee story and how important it is now to be able to tell that story, whereas perhaps a few years ago it may have seemed obvious.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Nawaaz, something that I wanted to ask you as you were reading. So, for folks who may not know, the book tracks your novel 'Radiant Fugitives also tracks American politics over quite a long period of at least modern American history. And you have Obama, and you have that initial rise of a sense of optimism, I would describe it, and then as we get further along into your book, that sense of optimism is really questioned, and kind of perhaps connecting with what Andrew was talking about a moment ago. And so I'm curious, for you as an author, having written that trajectory, lived through that trajectory, where do you stand now, and where do you find hope? You're on mute.
I said all these wonderful things and then it was on mute, so I'm not going to repeat any of that. Thank you, Jay. I was just thinking about where I stood on hope. To be honest, in 2010, I think I was less hopeful than I was today. And that's a very odd position to be. But maybe that was because we had like 4 years intervening that were pretty dark. And so coming out of that feels like there is more hope now than even in 2010. When Obama was elected, and when I started writing this novel, I think I felt like I personally, but a lot of other immigrants too, were being subject to two different forces. One, I think, as a gay American, I had this whole, in 2010, we also had this sense of marriage itself, I mean, rights being under threat. There was there was a race to to put a ban, include a ban in the constitutions of various states. And that was going on at the same time as we also had a rise in Islamophobia. We had a lot of protests all around the country. I speak about one in Texas, Irvine, but it's actually based a little bit on the one in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where there was a big where Islamic Center, they were protesting the building of an Islamic Center there. And there was also another one in New York with Ground Zero Mosque, or what they call the Ground Zero Mosque constructions. So I think I was reacting to both of those. And it did feel at that time that that they presaged something pretty dark for the future, which was not what everybody was feeling at that time. At that time, at least in 2008, we had this moment of hope with Obama's thing. But and I've always felt like Obama was too optimistic when he said, we have to bridge these gaps and we can do it. Yes, we can was his message. Lately, I've been reading his speeches again, and his book that came out in 2020. And there was this quote I actually gave at the beginning of this thing when I read about, I'm firm in my belief that the interests we share as human beings are far more powerful than the forces that drive us apart. And I feel like that is important to hold on to, that if we lose that faith, then we can't make progress. And everybody has to subscribe to that, because I think without that, we are going to be at a standstill. And so even though initially I felt he was being optimistic, I think that's the only message that we can actually hold on to. That is the only way forward. The more divisions there are, as Andrew says, we cannot really make progress on the immigration issues or what to do with the refugees. We saw that with Afghanistan right now, where there was a huge protest against taking as many refugees as we can in a war that was kind of started here in the US, or started by the US. So I think this particular notion of hope and of coming together has to be, we have to find an answer. I don't know what the answer is, but that seems to be the only way forward. So that's where I am as far as as a writer and looking at hope and how that works is. I was reminded while talking about this, Jay, about how you in parts of your novel, I mean, it does not just concern with the US. There's also another part of it where you said it in Bengal, and we do have refugees there as well, coming from what was Bangladesh or during the war, or towards into India, and we have a similar situation there where they are denied their rights, which is kind of a little bit different, at least in the novel, about how Jarek is treated in the United States around the same time. Can you speak to how you thought about those two differences, like of immigration and refugee movement to the US versus the one in Bangladesh to India? And how did you conceptualize those two differences and into your novel?
That's a wonderful question. And let me just say that I'm happy to hear that you are still holding on to that message from Obama. I feel like that is the essential message that we each have to keep underneath our pillows at night to keep going forward. So Yeah, as you say in the novel, there's also this thread about refugees from Bangladesh who crossed into India in 1972. And, in my own family, in my mother's side of the family, there are folks who are from Bangladesh and crossed over to India. So it's a familiar story for many Bengalis in some way, shape, or form. And I've been thinking about, as I was writing it, I thought a lot about the differences of that refugee experience versus, say, Yarick, who is coming to America from Poland vis-a-vis Germany. And there's something about New York City in particular that I feel is really important in this conversation. So the New York City that Yarick comes into is a city of immigrants. It's a city that knows and has in its fabric ladders for immigrants. It has communities for so many different types of immigrants. I mean, we certainly feel that today, but even in the context of the novel, that was already in place. And that, I think, is an extraordinary gift in our fabric. I mean, it's not just New York. I mean, we're in a event right now with a bookstore in Chicago, and Chicago ranks first in New American Economy's cities for immigrants. So I think that these structures by which you, as an immigrant, and I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about it, but I think in places like New York, the existence of those structures is a tremendous boon. And, we simply have not had a lot of those kinds of structures in place, certainly in places like Calcutta, where you had, a huge number of refugees that simply, we did not have the infrastructure for them, and we did not have systems in place, and we did not have communities of support by and large when they crossed over. Whereas, with Yarick, there are communities of support who are waiting for him when he arrives, and Misha when they arrive together. And that, makes all the difference for him and for, their lives together as they set up in New York, and as they start to become productive members of an American society. Thank you for that question. And so, Andrew, we both know Jen Miller, who's also a writer and has been highlighting stories at the local level. And I think that's such an effective way to change hearts and minds about the immigrant story. And I'm wondering, as you think about what narratives would be useful to you all, what are the stories that you would want to hear more of that you're not really hearing today? Like what would help NAE share its message more broadly?
I mean, bottom line is any and all stories. I feel like that is the one, I think, constant that we have found in our work over the past few years, is that the personal really is the sort of first step into perhaps getting into an otherwise closed door. Because if you are approached by something that's more familiar to you, for example, you hear the story of the family that owns the corner store in your neighborhood, in your small town even, and that's something instantly recognizable to you, and so you're perhaps more willing to listen to it and really take that story to heart as something that you can sympathize with and empathize with. So that's sort of bottom line. But I think, what we've also learned through COVID is that there are so many unheard stories, especially for immigrants who are working in jobs that go unheralded. We pay a lot of attention, or we did rather, to high-skilled immigrants that founded businesses that went on to have 9, 10 branches, and all these super success stories, which obviously is super compelling. But recently, especially during COVID, we wanted to hear more everyday stories about immigrants in their local communities that are doing hard work every day and that are strengthening their communities from within, and that not necessarily have a flashy story. And so, when you're talking about people in a small agriculture community, workers there who are helping family farms stay afloat, or who are helping, get produce to the market and things like that. Like, that's equally as important, we think, as a person who came and became an engineer and then did all these things, which is sort of the story, which is important, but also has been told many, many times. You can read it in any magazine, and so that's the approach that we're taking now. And I think we kind of think of our journalist team, which Jen, as you mentioned, heads up, as sort of like a StoryCorps, but specifically focused on the immigrant experience in the United States, and to really gather stories that are representative of the full breadth of that experience.
Andrew, I had a question regarding how do you navigate the tension between these kinds of stories you want to highlight, but also this pushback against the model minority, saying that we are here to, I mean, there is a kind of tension between saying.
There definitely is.
So.
Yeah, and I think this year, especially for Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, we made that one of the focuses of the month, because it was such a huge issue, especially given what's gone on in the past year with anti-Asian hate and things like that. We wanted to be able to tell a more nuanced story with our data, really about the true diversity when it comes to the socioeconomics or the socioeconomic characteristics of Asian Americans. And so, yes, you have great success stories of Indian Americans having the highest educational attainment for any ethnic group in the United States. But then you also have to pay attention to more communities that are struggling, because what the model minority stereotype does is that it masks the real needs of a lot of people.
Correct.
So even though Asian Americans have, say, the highest median income among ethnic groups in the United States, they also have the most income inequality. So that means the poorest Asians are even poorer on average than other Americans. And so you have communities, both national communities, but also geographic communities in the United States of Asian Americans that are in serious need. And I think because of that sort of erasure of their needs and the recognition of those needs that they go unheard of, people can kind of brush them aside and say, well, you're Asian, you're not struggling. And so
Yep.
That's really what we tried to do this past May to do. And those tensions are very real. I think when we first did our first report about Asian Americans and Asian immigrants, we got a lot of criticism from Asian American groups that said, well, this data is great. It's great to have it for different states and different areas broken down, but you're still talking about it as a monolith. And that's criticism that we really took to heart.
Wow, no, that makes absolute sense. Having to deal with both of that. I mean, this notion of the monolith is a big problem. I mean, we treat the country from outside, we treat the country as a monolith. And of course, inside, it's all these splintered groups that somehow have to coexist. Yeah.
And so, Nawaaz, I mean, this idea of the monolith and how, in fact, there are all of these varieties of experience, I think comes across really strongly in your novel. You have two sisters who, at least on the surface, couldn't be more different. One is very religiously observant, whereas the other is not at all, and is queer and is open about her sexuality, at least in her friend community. So as you were coming up with these two very different personas, was it for you an exploration of a larger political statement about what was happening? How did how did those two personas come about? Because they are quite different and almost polemical in nature.
um, I think I would like to say, quote the Flaubert, think that they're both me in some sense. I mean, there was time in my own youth when I did consider a more religious lifestyle. I think I was struggling with my sexuality, and religion, with its provided a safe space. At least it felt like it provide a safe space, in a sense, by foreclosing um, all options. By forcing a certain thing, then I did not have to deal with my own sexuality. And so that was something that I think I struggled with when I was younger. And at some point, I remember deciding that that wasn't the right thing for me, and I could not go through that. And so I think Tahara is that aspect of Tahara has been a part of me. And then when I came to the United States and I came out in this wonderful community, the South Asian LGBT community in San Francisco, with Tricone and all the rest. I mean, there were so many. That community was formed by activists who took the courage to come out, and activists who were very um, vocal about various things, not just about queer rights, but also about what was happening in the US with during the Iraq War and all the rest. And so I think I in a sense, I belong to these two communities, and I have aspired to be part of them, as in aspired to this activist nature of the LGBTQ community, as well as the more secure and safe aspects that a religion like Islam can provide. And I think I was trying to explore those tensions within myself. And yes, so I split them into two different, very divergent characters. Um, and of course, you need some drama and a lot of conflict if you're going to write something. It seemed like the thing to do. Um, so yeah, that's how those two characters came about.
That's beautiful. And I love that Flaubert statement, and of course the Whitman-esque statement of
I can feel multitudes.
multitudes. Yeah.
Yes. How did you decide, or how did you go about writing about Yarik and Misha in this novel? Like, how did they come to you, and how did you embody them?
Well, it was very difficult for me to embody those two characters in particular because I felt like I was, there are parts of this novel that take place in India, but their story also takes place in Poland. And I had to ask myself questions of, well, how can I write about the story? What are the privileges that I'm bringing to this conversation? What are the things that I may not even be aware of? And so to be able to write their story authentically, I felt like I had to do the research, and I had to do that both from a historical sense, but also from the sense of character research and all the things that, we as writers do to get close to our characters. In my case, my favorite technique, which I've talked about, is keeping journals. So I have book-length journals of Yarek and Misha and Lucy, who's the other main character of this novel, and writing in their voices, and asking those questions, the mundane questions, as well as more of the things that only come up between lovers or close friends, asking those questions allowed me to gain more insight into who they were. as human beings. So, Andrew, it looks like we only have a few minutes left. I feel like this hour has just flown by, but I wanted to ask you one more question if I could, and it's going back to the 1965 Refugee Act, which was such a crucial piece of legislation. And if you could just talk through how that came to be, and what we might need in this moment to achieve that kind of structural change.
The latter part of that question is difficult, but so the 1965 Act really is sort of the pinnacle, at least in terms of immigration, when it comes to the social justice movements that are sort of brewing in the 60s. And so when you think about the civil rights movement as well as happening and building at the same time, which obviously is focused on African Americans, at the same time, this sort of perhaps introduction of race as a topic that is widely discussed in American politics is happening, and people are turning to immigration as well in this sort of, re-looking at all these different structures that have been in place in the United States. And so I mentioned some of those earlier laws because I wanted to give context and really show how transformative that 1965 Act was, especially when it comes to immigration from Asia. So I mentioned the 1921 Act, then the 1924 Asian Exclusion Act, but it also even goes even farther to 1882 and the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so you have a decades-long history of very restrictive, very exclusionary policies focused particularly on people from the Asian continent. At the same time, there's almost no restrictions on immigration from the Western Hemisphere. So from North or South America, there's basically no laws that govern that until you get to 1965. And then obviously from Europe, you have this open door policy of European immigration. And from the 1921 Act that I mentioned, it's clear what the policy was in place, what it was meant to do. It was to preserve the ethnic and racial makeup of the United States. And so basically, I was actually looking up, refreshing some of these numbers in my head, but Pew Research Center basically estimated what the US today would look like if the 1965 Act, the Immigration and Naturalization Act, had not passed and done away with that ethnic origins formula. And so whereas today you have about 7, perhaps even more now, that article came out a couple of years ago, about 7% of the population today in the United States is Asian American. Without the 1965 Act, you would have less than 1%. So really, I owe my being here to that act, and I think we all do. And so, it is very much in that the Great Society that LBJ wanted to build and to have these really bold policies moving forward. And there was momentum around that, before people became really disillusioned with Great Society and all of those, the foundations of what we consider today to be, quote unquote, the welfare state. This was part of those big pieces of legislation. So that brings me to the latter part of your question, which is, I don't know. I mean, that's such a huge question. It's so tied up in so many different things. You can see that there is the political will to do that, and they're trying to fit immigration into all these other kinds of bills. So the political will is there, but obviously to build consensus to that is the big question. And I wish I had Nawaaz's hope, or at least a little bit of it, but I don't know. I mean, it's so tied up into, at least I feel, into these societal movements and yearnings for change, not specifically in immigration, but I think generally in society.
Thank you for that candid answer. And I see that there actually is a question that we missed from the audience. So I'm wondering, Nawaaz, if you want to take this question. I'll just read it out loud here. It feels like we put a lot of pressure on stories, especially stories of often marginalized voices, to help inspire empathy among readers or to help people think differently about politicized topics. Did you feel any of that pressure while writing these books? Did it affect the way you approached your story or your characters? And you're on mute.
In my case, I mean, I do. I mean, I did not think of these stories as marginalized just because they were like my own stories. I mean, these were the stories of my own community, and they are kind of marginalized in the broader society. But I wasn't writing from that place. I was writing from the place of just telling these stories. And the idea was not to create empathy the idea was more like, how do we try to bridge these differences? And are these differences even bridgeable by taking, as you said, these two kind of characters who are so far apart in my book? The point was not to try to get empathy for any of them, but to explore if these two characters could find some common ground or not. And if it is, where do we go to? And that's where I had to cling to Obama's words, because it seemed like, even though as much as I don't have hope in them, they are still the bedrock of what we need. So they're aspirational quote, Andrew. It's not like I have the hope. It's like, this is what we all need to be believing in, and this is what we need to believe in. Otherwise, there is very little hope. Yeah. Anyone else who wants to answer that, like Andrew or Jay?
I will say that for me, I am generally not thinking about the reader when I'm writing. You know, for me, it is an experience of getting to know and be in relationship with my characters. So I'm not thinking really about the effect that this might have on the reader and until really it's out in the world, to be quite frank, because for me, it is that more intimate communion that happens when you get to know someone as if they become a close friend to you, you know, and I'm trying to understand their story. And, but I completely, you know, I understand the sort of the subtext of that question, which is that perhaps there are even a set of subconscious pressures that steer us toward telling certain stories over others. And I think as writers and as citizens, we have to be vigilant about that and be clear about our intentions and why we get to the page and for what. Thank you for that question. And I know we're a few minutes over time, so I just want to see, Josie, if you're still there, if you're going to be taking us out.
Hey, guys. This has been maybe one of my favorite events in our short bookstore history. Thank you all so much for being here. This really was such a fantastic conversation. I would love to let y'all keep talking for another hour if you wanted. But I know people have families and things to get back to. I just want to remind everyone while we're here, one, you can purchase both of these books. The link for Madison Street Books website is in the chat. But feel free to support your own indie bookstore as well. And this registration link will stay active for at least a year. I haven't tested it past that. Anyone can register and watch this recorded event at any time. Feel free to share it with your friends or anyone else who you think may enjoy this conversation as much as I did. But I just wanted to give one more thanks to everyone. Really, this has been such a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much, Josie and Madison Street Books, and thank you, Andrew and Nawaaz, and thanks to everyone who joined tonight. It was a really lovely conversation.
Thank you all.
Likewise. Thank you all. Yes.
Great.
Bye, guys. Have a great evening.
You too.
You too.